So this talk is also a brief personal history of how I came to have an interest in stigma, naming, framing, and advocacy. About 12 years ago, Bob Shapiro was creating the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy, and he needed a vice president, so he asked me, strangely enough, nominated me to become a Palatucci Fellow, which trained me in advocacy. We started to focus on NIH and the funding, underfunding of migraine, and we were, struggling with why it was so hard to get NIH and other groups to increase interest in funding in migraine headache. And then I saw a paper, and we postulated that the stigma of migraine must be involved, but we didn't know much about it. So I saw a paper on measuring stigma in chronic diseases, and the next day, an intern about to become a neurology resident needed a project, and lo and behold, the Stigma project and ultimately the paper was born, and soon I was a world expert on migraine stigma. A conversation at the AHDA led to the question, is migraine a disease? And we started to ponder what language should be used to describe migraine. And I put together a Delphi group and got their answers and wrote a paper about it. And in this process, I was sent a paper on migraine branding, and it occurred to me that industry, pharma, thinks about branding of disease all the time, but really, ultimately, patients and their doctors should be, and scientists should be the ones who are framing the disease and should think very carefully about how that's done. And in order to improve migraine perception and framing, I became involved in Miles for Migraine, and suddenly I'm now the president of Miles for Migraine. In 2017, at the Academy of Neurology meeting in a dark and dingy bar, people had been coming up to us, saying, all these advocacy groups, they're all scattered about, we don't know how to deal with this, how does one view this space? And so we created a coalition on the back of an envelope, and within 2 months, we were fully funded, and a few weeks later, we hired somebody, and we've been, and CHAMP has been growing exponentially. Some of the accomplishments, CHAMP language and image guidelines, Retreat Migraine, and the Shut the Door on Migraine Stigma Symposium. That's a brief overview of how I came involved and what I've done in this area. But it all started for me when I was presenting as a young attending about 25 years ago a poster on migraine, and a neuromuscular attending came by, a very nice woman, and as she left my poster, she wasn't really into headache, but it was very a kindness for her to stop by. She said, "I'm glad you do headache. I don't like treating those patients." And that, I remember that feeling as she walked away, something that made me think something's not quite right with this picture, and led me, I think, to think about disease stigma. So this is one type of stigma, migraine. On the x-axis, you see the disability associated with various diseases. I have migraine outlined over there, and you can see that migraine is the worst funded of all the major diseases that's tracked by the NIH. On the y-axis is NIH funding, and just if you're a neurologist, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and epilepsy are kind of on the line. The overfunded diseases are cancer and HIV, and migraine and lung diseases are the underfunded diseases. And this is a log-log scale, so this distance of migraine to the regression line, where if migraine is treated fairly, it should be, is not like 50%, but it's about 12 times. Funding should be about 12 times more than it is. The first organization that I would have been involved, and I am still involved, is the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy. I became the vice president, then the president, and now I'm the past president of that organization. It was started in 2007, and at that time, its signature activity, which is bringing people to Washington to advocate for headache-related issues once a year, first brought 45 participants from 29 states, touching 136 congressional districts. In 2019, we've grown to 160 participants from 42 states and touching 223 congressional districts. Our issues have been increasing NIH funding, counting migraine as a disease. When we started, migraine wasn't even counted. Even though it's the second most disabling disease in the world, NIH wasn't counting it and couldn't tell us how much money they were funding migraine. They were giving to migraine. We've advocated for fair grant review, oxygen for cluster headache. The HEAL initiative, which is an opioid bill, we were able to put into the bill funding for developing non-opioid treatments in order to reduce pain treatments, in order to reduce the opioid crisis. And plenty of people enter opioid addiction starting from pain and from migraine as well. So we've got money allocated for pain and migraine research, and we're working also on getting Social Security to count migraine as a legitimate disease that you can apply for disability for. So, what is stigma? Stigma is an established construct that describes an attribute, trait, or disorder that is deeply discrediting and may elicit some form of community sanction. And I would say that underfunded NIH research is a form of community sanction, among many things. And the real world expert on stigma is Joanna Kempner. She actually wrote a whole book about it. So I'd like to give a shout out to her, and I'd like people who see this to recognize some of the people that I think are the most influential and important people in headache advocacy. So Joanna Kempner actually wrote a book and describing how migraine is viewed as a woman's disease and how that filters back to the stigmatization of migraine, and in fact pain in general in women is dismissed and stigmatized. There are several types of stigma, and I'm going to teach you about three. There's structural stigma, which is prejudice and discrimination by policy, law, and constitutional practice. Public stigma, so stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, and that's what, those little things that, people say to you, your boss, your family members, your second cousin, that kind of, I think of them as microaggressions that, over time have a profound effect, and they lead to self-stigma, which is, people with a stigmatizing disease inevitably develop shame, low self-esteem, and a lack of engagement with treatment. So just to sort of restate this, in light of the instrument I used to study stigma, the Stigma Scale for Chronic Illness, or the SSCI. So a person experiences enacted stigma, these things that people say or hint or allude to, They'll recognize that there's a problem with the disease that they have. Eventually, they develop stereotype agreement. If all of society is saying that, you know, you're not trying hard enough if you have migraine, eventually it actually sinks in and they get self-concurrence or internalization, and this is the self-stigma process. And then they get internalized stigma, which leads to low self-esteem and psychological distress. So that's the stigmatization process that underlies the instrument. And the instrument measures stigma on a score from 24 to 120. And I studied people who had episodic migraine, chronic migraine, and epilepsy in Jefferson's clinics. And as you can see, episodic migraine and epilepsy had very similar levels of stigma, but chronic migraine was much more stigmatized, and there was many more patients with high scores than these other diseases. So, in summary, in our clinics, chronic migraine had more stigma associated with it than episodic migraine and epilepsy. The ability to work best predicts stigma. The mental component of the quality of life measurement strongly correlated with stigma, but this may be the result of the stigma, not the cause. The physical component score of quality of life only slightly predicts stigma. And in a regression model where we regress against the disability, chronic migraine and epilepsy are equally stigmatized, whereas episodic migraine is not quite as stigmatized. So those were my findings, and I think that has had a really nice pickup in the migraine community, and you'll see many people kind of referring to and recognizing that now migraine is stigmatized. In the course of this work, somebody asked, you know, is migraine a disease or not? And so I thought this was something we could do something about, so we thought about how to do this. You know, naming a disease reflects the biomedical evidence, but it's also a social process of negotiation. You know, it's not just, there isn't like one thing that says something should be called a disease. It also needs sort of general public acceptance and acceptance of content experts. And examples of how things are renamed. Osteoporosis is now a disease, erectile dysfunction from a symptom to a disease. Homosexuality used to be a disease and now it's demedicalized. Obesity there's still a debate whether to call that a disease. And some people think that you know, pharma and patient advocacy groups are disease monitoring. They want to call everything a disease because that gives them more recognition and gets them more resource and sympathy. So I convened a panel and we didn't agree to much. We agreed that we should say migraine and not migraine headache. I think it's pretty much criminal to just say migraine is a headache or imply that. Migraine has a whole host of other symptoms associated with it, which are at least as important as the pain for most patients. We don't like a psychiatric valence, like migraine type person. Sufferer, I think, is something that the individual can choose to say about themselves or not, but we should not say that about someone else. And ultimately, the variability of symptoms of migraine and impact require more than one term. So it's really okay that we can call it a disease sometimes and a disorder another time, that the elasticity of the language is actually an advantage for a disease or condition that has so many different types of manifestation like migraine. And we agreed to disagree about disease, although a plurality of people favored disease over the other choices, and many people were reluctant to give up Migraine, although I should say that it's really politically incorrect to infuse somebody with a disease, with their whole being with that disease, like an epileptic or a depressive, when it's supposed to say, according to the American Psychological Association, you know, a person with depression or a person with schizophrenia. So, although we came out with these findings and these non-conclusions, I decided to write an editorial which had a lot, where I said, here, this is what I believe, and this had a lot more impact. But finally, the greatest impact was when a coalition of headache patients, CHAMP, came together, and they processed this and came up with recommendations for what patients want to be addressed as with their disease migraine, and here they are. I would say that, you know, well, there are many suggestions that they have, and if you're a medical editor, I hope you read these very, very carefully. In your own life, if you stop saying I have migraines and just say I have migraine, stressing that this is a disease or condition or disorder that you have constantly, and talk about attacks as opposed to migraines, I think you're doing a better service and helping people to really understand migraine better if you speak of it that way. And I think that medication overuse headache is a stigmatizing way of dealing with it. I won't use it in my clinic. I keep writing rebound headache. I take it out, and I keep asking the International Classification of Headache Disorders to rename medication overuse headache and call it something else. I suggested medication adaptation headache. I don't care if they pick that or not. I just want them to pick something that doesn't stigmatize migraine patients. And then we've turned to thinking about migraine framing. Migraine, all diseases are framed. It is, it is that concept, that feeling you get very quickly when you think about a disease. If you think about headache, you think about, oh, traffic was a headache today. It's really a trivial, a nuisance thing, and it's really needs to be reframed out of that. Think of the framing of cancer, and that's sort of synonymous with a serious and worsening condition. Reframing has been successful in my life. When I was a medical student, the AIDS epidemic struck, and it was astonishing how over a few years the whole thing turned around and was flipped, and people with AIDS or HIV now called or treated with much better than they used to be, with much more justice and empathy, and with much better care. Impetus since has been reframed to erectile dysfunction, and cancer victim to cancer survivor as a few examples of disease reframing. Migraine has a lousy frame. It's seen as an easy to treat condition of white middle class women who can't cope very well. It's thought of as something irritating, and scientific presentations, the migraine brain is a brain that can't handle stress, sort of feeding back on this sort of incompetent middle class white woman who's can't handle stress and therefore is shirking their social responsibilities. But it doesn't have to be that way. Catherine Foxhall, pictured here, has noticed that before the 1700s, migraine was viewed kind of neutrally. Between a broken bone and tuberculosis was migraine. There were remedies, there were things that you do, you managed it, it didn't have the negative frame. And something dramatic changed in the 1700s. And ever since then, people with migraine have been looked down upon, and viewed as weak, poor copers who shirk their responsibilities. So we recently had the Coalition for Headache and Migraine Patients had a symposium. These are my opinions we're writing a white paper, and I'll have to get rid of that slide, this slide once everybody else weighs it. But here's what I'm taking for now out of that symposium. The number one important thing for people to do to reframe the disease is to disclose. We need to start to teach people to talk about and how to talk about their disease to one another, to their family members, to their bosses. They are doing everything they can to hide it and not to let people know that they have a migraine disease. And it's harming the field. It's enhancing the stigma. It's feeding into the negative frame. Empathy should be nurtured. The pain of women in general is discounted, and migraine is viewed as a women's disease, and the pain and symptoms of migraine are not seen empathetically. And we should show the human part of it and teach people to feel empathy for persons with migraine. Brain disease will fail. It harmed the movement to destigmatize mental illness. And unfortunately, although migraine is very much a brain disease, that's where most of the symptoms are coming from, this will fail if that is our message. New disease frames can harm, and so to do a good job, we need to study the right frame. We need to let patients lead. All of those diseases, examples where disease was reframed in cancer, in HIV, those were led, the power of those movements came from the patients themselves or their family members. Think about autism and Alzheimer's, how the family members are driving those social movements to reframe disease. And then specific actions need to be taken, working on structural stigma, on enacted or interpersonal stigma, and on internalized stigma to reverse these these aspects. Now on to advocacy. How do you change a frame? It involves effective advocacy. Advocacy is one way to contribute to your field. We have a responsibility as physicians to be advocates for patients, whether it's filling out their forms or telling them that that it's not their fault that they have migraine. We have a responsibility if it's that small, and in the larger social context, I think we have other larger responsibilities. We have a unique position. We have knowledge about the disease. We have knowledge about impact. We have resources available to us. We have the information pipeline is visible to us. We have access to patient groups. They listen to us. They treat us well. And we need, and we meet the people who should be part of effective coalitions that will improve the view of migraine for patients, and really for us as providers for people with migraine disease. The stigma of migraine as a disease and against the migraine patient, it splashes back onto the doctor who takes care of them. So I want to tell you a little bit about Models for Migraine. I've been involved with that for the last few years, and I was recently elected to be president. I'm very excited by it, even though I don't like to run, because it's occurred to me that only participatory advocacy is effective at reframing a disease. So if someone gets together in a Facebook group, that's great. It may have a lot of social benefits, but it doesn't reframe a disease like migraine the way people getting together for a walk, run, for an education day, for other activities where they congregate and are seen. Those have true impact that can change the way the rest of society sees the disease. Running for Research is another excellent organization that puts on walk runs. They have a slightly different focus on how they use their money, but they've been very effective and they've done a lot of good through their races. Miles for Migraine also has adolescent camps, patient education days, sort of 3/4 day courses where patients will talk to one another, doctors, pain psychologists, social workers, experts on disability, and so forth. Will talk to patients and teach them. We have the historian spoke at, Catherine Foxhall spoke at one of our education days. We have in-person support groups and meetups. So here's what's been happening with Miles for Migraine. In 2016, we had 2 walk runs. By 2017, we had 5 post-race breakfast, medical education group, education support group, a virtual challenge. 2018, we're up to 20, and in 2019, we think we're going to have 35 activities, and we hope to continue to expand. And our event participants have also been expanded. So I want to tell you about CHAMP, because I believe that the patients that a reframing movement, a social movement to improve the lot of people with migraine, it has to be energized from the patients. The doctors cannot be the principal source of the energy to reframe the disease. That's been true throughout disease advocacy. It's often started with doctors, but at some point, either in a nice way or in a confrontational way, patients of the successful groups have kind of muscled out the doctors, have taken at least parity in their relationship about the disease presenting itself to the public, or have taken the lead role. So, in the American Cancer Society, the president cannot be a physician. It's a patient, it's someone else. It's not a physician's group, it's an advocacy group. So CHAMP was formed when we met in a bar and we jotted things down on the back of the envelope. Astonishingly, in 2 months, we had sign-on from the groups. We existed, we hired an employee, we had dollars in the bank. We've now had 5 meetings and we're growing. We're creating cohesion. We have a shared mission. Each member supports the other ones. Patient energy is driving this movement. We responded. We were instrumental. We had the largest patient response to ICER, which was to determine the value of treatment relative to the value of disease. So this is an advocacy issue. And we got the patient's voice heard. When Elle magazine came out with the migraine pose, in which beautiful women frame their heads and put pressure over their temples with their fingers and show off their fingernails, the CHAMP was meeting, and it was like unleashing the hounds that went after Elle, and pretty soon the story about the migraine pose was not about the migraine pose, but about the backlash to the migraine pose. We had the first migraine patient conference, Retreat Migraine, astonishingly successful. And imagine 200 people with mostly chronic migraine getting together and creating a culture that surrounds this disease. It was an amazing thing to behold. And hopefully we'll be having this retreat each year, and it'll grow. And then the CHAMP has we have put together the Shut the Door on Migraine Stigma Symposium. Hopefully we'll get a white paper, we'll get some actionable items in a direction that we can take to reduce migraine stigma and change the way disease is perceived. So here's the CHAMP membership. I think it's 24 organizations that includes American Migraine Foundation, National Headache Foundations, 2 cluster groups, Shine Her Light, Danielle Byron Henry Migraine Foundation, Healthy Women, so not just migraine, but some groups that have sort of a wider disease menu or disease interest, and then for-profit organizations like migraine.com, and then some of the top bloggers in the country. So between all of these organizations and for-profits and people, if we have a message, we can coalesce and really reach, hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million people with migraine. So I think it's a powerful organization, a powerful concept that might be able to make some difference. So here are some of the people I'd like to shout out. You may recognize some of them. Mary Franklin from National Headache Foundation, and Malvani from American Migraine Foundation, Joanna Kempner, who's the world's expert on stigma and the only sociologist so far who's taken any interest, Bob Shapiro, who's #1 guy for policy, first president of the Reliance for Headache Disorders. These fierce women over here, Shirley Kessel, the past president and chief executive officer of Miles for Migraine, Amal Starling, who's every day in her clinic is the fiercest warrior I know against migraine stigma, Kevin Lenneberg and Katie Golden, who've brought CHAMP into existence, and Katie McDonald, who's the force behind the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy with Bob, and Catherine Foxhall, the first historian to really take an interest in migraine disease. And I'd like to thank all of them and thank all of you for listening.